There is a point in most financial lives where money stops behaving like a tool and starts behaving like gravity. And once that shift happens, every decision begins to orbit around survival instead of progress, which is exactly where debt cycles begin, not as a single mistake, but as a system that quietly reshapes how choices are made over time. At first, the entry into debt rarely feels dramatic. It often looks small and manageable, a purchase that stretches slightly beyond current income, a temporary imbalance justified by future expectations, and in isolation, each decision seems rational, even responsible, because the human brain is designed to prioritize immediate stability over long-term optimization, which means solving today's problem almost always wins over preventing tomorrow's one. This is where the psychological loop forms, because once a portion of future income is already committed, the structure of decision-making changes. Every dollar earned is no longer fully available, and instead of asking, what builds forward, the question quietly becomes, what keeps me afloat? And that subtle shift is what traps people, not the debt itself, but the narrowing of available choices. To understand why this becomes so difficult to escape, you have to look at the math beneath it, because debt is not just subtraction, it is time displacement, meaning you are effectively spending future labor in the present, and when interest is introduced, that future cost expands, turning a fixed problem into a moving one, where the total required effort grows faster than the payments being made. If you imagine a simple structure where someone earns a consistent income, but a percentage of it is always redirected toward past decisions, then their usable income is permanently reduced, and any unexpected expense, even a small one, cannot be absorbed without creating new debt, which means the system feeds itself, not through failure, but through normal life variability. Over time, this creates what can be described as a financial compression zone, where income, expenses, and obligations are so tightly packed that there is no room for error, and more importantly, no room for opportunity, because opportunities often require temporary imbalance, whether that is investing, relocating, or even taking time to learn something new, and a compressed system cannot tolerate that kind of movement. This is why many people feel like they are working constantly but not progressing, because effort alone does not expand capacity when the system itself is constrained. And this is a critical distinction, since most financial advice focuses on increasing effort, working more hours, earning more money, but rarely addresses the structural issue, which is that without reducing the constraints, additional income often gets absorbed into the same cycle. There is also a cognitive layer to this, because debt introduces a persistent mental load. Every decision carries a background calculation. Every purchase is evaluated not just by cost, but by consequence, and over time, this reduces clarity, increases stress, and leads to more short-term thinking, which ironically reinforces the very patterns that sustain the cycle. From a broader economic perspective, this is not an isolated phenomenon. It is systemic, because modern financial systems are designed around accessibility, which lowers the barrier to entry for debt, but does not equally lower the barrier to exit, meaning it is easier to enter the system than it is to leave it. And this asymmetry is what keeps cycles persistent across entire populations. If you look historically, similar patterns appear in different forms, whether through credit expansion periods or shifts in lending practices. The structure remains consistent. Access is widened during growth phases, and constraints tighten during correction phases. But individuals operating within the system experience it as a personal struggle rather than a structural one. This brings us to the concept of thresholds, because escaping a debt cycle is not a gradual linear process. It often requires crossing a specific point where income is no longer fully consumed by obligations, and a margin begins to form, even if it is small, because that margin is what restores optionality, and optionality is what allows different decisions to exist in the first place. Without that margin, every decision is reactive, but with even a slight buffer, decisions can become proactive, and that distinction changes everything, not instantly, but structurally, because now the system has space to absorb variability without collapsing back into debt. Mathematically, you can think of this as shifting from a negative compounding environment to a neutral one, and eventually to a positive one, where instead of interest working against you, time begins to work with you. But reaching that point requires not just income, but stability in the relationship between income and obligations. What makes this difficult is that the behaviors required to escape the cycle often feel counterintuitive, because they involve slowing down consumption, resisting immediate solutions, and prioritizing structural change over temporary relief, which can feel uncomfortable in the short term, especially when the pressure to resolve problems quickly is constant. At the identity level, this is where the deepest shift happens, because as long as someone sees themselves as reacting to financial pressure, their decisions will reflect that position. But when the focus shifts toward creating space, even in small increments, the role changes from reactive participant to system builder, and that shift influences every subsequent choice. It is important to understand that this is not about eliminating all debt instantly, which is rarely realistic, but about changing the trajectory of the system so that over time, the constraints loosen instead of tighten, and the direction of movement becomes more important than the current position. Eventually, as margin increases, the cycle begins to weaken, not because of a single breakthrough, but because the reinforcing loop is disrupted, fewer decisions are made under pressure, fewer new obligations are added, and the system gradually transitions into a state where stability is no longer fragile. And once that point is reached, money begins to behave differently again, not as gravity pulling everything inward, but as a tool that can be directed outward, toward growth, flexibility, and long-term planning, which is where financial systems start to expand rather than compress. The key realization is that most people do not fail to escape debt because of lack of effort, but because they are operating inside a system that continuously reduces their available choices. And until that system changes, the outcomes tend to repeat, regardless of intention. So the goal is not to fight the cycle directly, but to gradually create the conditions where the cycle can no longer sustain itself. Because once the structure shifts, the results begin to follow, not immediately, but predictably over time. And once that point is reached, money begins to behave differently again, not as gravity pulling everything inward, but as a tool that can be directed outward, toward growth, flexibility, and long-term planning, which is where financial systems start to expand rather than compress. But even here, something subtle continues to happen beneath the surface, because escaping a debt cycle does not automatically restore clarity. It simply creates the conditions where clarity becomes possible, and many people, after reaching stability, still operate with the same decision patterns that were formed under constraint, which means the external situation changes faster than the internal model. This creates a quiet second phase that is rarely discussed, where the system is no longer collapsing, but it is not yet fully optimized. And in this phase, decisions often default to safety rather than strategy, because the memory of instability is still present, influencing behavior even when the immediate pressure has been removed. From a mathematical perspective, this is where opportunity cost begins to re-enter the equation in a meaningful way, because when survival is no longer the dominant constraint, every allocation of money starts to carry a different kind of weight, not just in terms of what it solves, but in terms of what it prevents. And this is where many systems plateau, not due to lack of income, but due to conservative allocation patterns that limit expansion. If earlier phases were defined by negative compounding, where each decision reduced future capacity, this phase is often defined by neutral compounding, where decisions neither significantly harm nor meaningfully accelerate progress. And while this is stable, it does not produce transformation, it simply maintains position. To move beyond this, the structure must shift again, not through risk, but through controlled asymmetry, where small portions of resources are intentionally directed toward areas that have the potential to expand capacity, whether that is skill development, asset acquisition, or systems that reduce future effort. And this is where financial behavior begins to transition from defensive to constructive. What becomes important here is not the size of these allocations, but their consistency and direction, because even small shifts, when applied repeatedly over time, begin to alter the trajectory of the system. And this is where positive compounding starts to emerge, not suddenly, but gradually, as the relationship between time and money changes once again. There is also a deeper structural insight at this stage, which is that stability without direction can quietly become stagnation, because while the absence of pressure feels like progress, it does not inherently create growth, and without intentional movement, systems tend to settle into equilibrium. even if that equilibrium is far below their potential capacity. This is why understanding the difference between stability and expansion is critical, because one preserves the system, while the other evolves it, and both are necessary, but they must occur in sequence, not simultaneously, since attempting to expand before achieving stability often collapses the system, while remaining stable for too long prevents it from developing further. At the behavioral level, this requires another identity shift, one that is less about escaping pressure and more about directing resources with intention, where decisions are no longer filtered through urgency, but through alignment with long-term structure. And this is where financial thinking becomes less reactive and more architectural. In many ways, this mirrors patterns seen in larger economic systems, where periods of contraction are followed by stabilization and then expansion, and while the scale is different, the underlying mechanics are similar, because both individuals and systems respond to constraints, adapt to them, and eventually attempt to move beyond them once capacity allows. However, what differentiates individuals who continue to progress from those who plateau is not access to information, but consistency in applying structural thinking over time, because once the immediate pressure is gone, there is less external force pushing change, and progress becomes a function of internal discipline rather than necessity. This is where time begins to play a different role again, because earlier, time was working against the system through interest and obligation, but now, if the structure is aligned correctly, time begins to amplify decisions in a positive direction, and small advantages, when sustained, start to accumulate in ways that are not immediately visible, but become significant over longer horizons. And this brings the entire cycle into perspective, because what began as a constraint-driven system gradually transforms into an opportunity-driven one, not through a single moment of change, but through a series of structural adjustments that alter how decisions interact with time. The key realization here is that debt cycles are not just financial. They are behavioral and structural, and escaping them requires more than eliminating balances. It requires changing the underlying system that produced them, because without that change, the same patterns tend to reemerge, even under different circumstances. So when people ask why most never escape these cycles, the answer is not simply that they fail to try, but that the system they are operating within continues to reinforce the same outcomes. And unless that system is gradually reshaped, effort alone is not enough to produce a different result. And once that reshaping begins, even slowly, the direction of movement changes. And while the external results may take time to reflect that shift, the internal structure has already begun to move toward expansion, which is the point where progress becomes not just possible, but sustainable over time. And over longer periods, something even more subtle begins to take shape, because once a system transitions into a positive structure, the effects are no longer immediately tied to effort, meaning the relationship between action and outcome becomes less visible in the short term. And this can create a different kind of challenge, where consistency must be maintained without constant reinforcement. This is where many systems either accelerate quietly or begin to drift, because without the pressure of instability, there is less urgency guiding behavior, and decisions start to rely more heavily on internal standards rather than external necessity, which makes discipline less about reacting and more about maintaining alignment over time. From a structural standpoint, this phase introduces the concept of delayed visibility, where the results of good decisions are not immediately apparent, but accumulate beneath the surface, similar to how earlier debt accumulated invisibly before becoming noticeable, except now the direction has reversed, and instead of compounding against the system, time is compounding in its favor. However, because human perception is heavily influenced by immediate feedback, this delay can lead to underestimating progress, or worse, abandoning effective patterns too early, not because they are ineffective, but because they are not yet visible. And this is one of the less discussed reasons why long-term financial systems often break down after initial stability is achieved. To counter this, the structure must include not just financial adjustments, but cognitive ones, where progress is measured not solely by outcomes, but by the consistency of inputs, because in a compounding system, inputs are what determine trajectory, while outcomes are simply delayed reflections of those inputs. This reframing is critical because it shifts attention away from short-term fluctuations and toward long-term direction, which stabilizes behavior even when external results appear flat. And over time, this consistency allows the underlying system to mature without constant interruption. There is also an important asymmetry here, which is that small negative deviations can have a disproportionate impact compared to small positive ones, especially in early stages of recovery, because while positive compounding builds gradually, negative disruptions can immediately reduce capacity, pulling the system back toward constraint if not managed carefully. This is why maintaining structural integrity becomes more important than maximizing gains, because the goal is not rapid expansion, but sustainable expansion, where each layer of progress reinforces the next rather than destabilizing it. And this requires a level of restraint that often feels counterintuitive in environments that emphasize speed and scale. Over time, as stability deepens and consistency holds, the system begins to exhibit a different kind of behavior, where optionality expands, not just in terms of financial choices, but in terms of time, energy, and attention. And this is one of the clearest indicators that the cycle has been fully disrupted, because decisions are no longer constrained by immediate necessity. At this point, the role of money shifts again, becoming less about solving problems and more about enabling direction, which allows for decisions that are aligned with longer-term structures rather than short-term pressures. And this is where planning begins to extend further into the future, not as speculation, but as structured allocation of resources across time. In a broader sense, this represents a complete inversion of the original state, where instead of the future being consumed to support the present begins to support the future, and this shift is what ultimately separates systems that remain cyclical from those that become progressive. But even here, the system is not static, because external conditions continue to change, economic environments shift, opportunities emerge and disappear, and maintaining progress requires ongoing adaptation, not in reaction to pressure, but in response to changing structures, which means the process never fully ends, it simply evolves. And this is perhaps the most important perspective to hold, that financial systems are not problems to be solved once, but structures to be managed continuously, and the difference between being trapped in a cycle and moving beyond it is not perfection, but the ability to adjust the system over time without reverting to patterns that recreate constraint. So when viewed in full, the reason most people never escape debt cycles is not because escape is impossible, but because it requires a sequence of structural, psychological, and behavioral shifts that must occur in alignment. And when even one of those elements is missing, the system tends to revert to its previous state. But when those elements do align, even gradually, the change becomes self-reinforcing, and the same mechanisms that once maintained the cycle begin to work in the opposite direction, supporting stability, enabling growth, and allowing the system to expand over time without collapsing back into constraint. And in that sense, the goal is not to eliminate difficulty, but to change how the system responds to it. Because once the structure is strong enough, challenges no longer create cycles. They simply become variables within a system that is capable of absorbing them, adapting to them, and continuing forward without losing its direction. And as this system continues to evolve, an even deeper layer becomes visible, one that is less about money itself and more about how individuals relate to uncertainty over time. Because at its core, every financial system is an attempt to manage the unknown, and the way that uncertainty is handled often determines whether a system remains stable or becomes fragile again. In earlier stages, uncertainty is a threat, something that must be minimized because the system lacks the capacity to absorb shocks, which is why even small disruptions can trigger a return to debt. But as stability increases, uncertainty gradually transforms from a risk into a variable, something that can be planned for, buffered against, and in some cases, even leveraged. This shift is important because it changes how decisions are evaluated, moving from a framework of avoidance to one of calibration, where the goal is not to eliminate uncertainty entirely, which is impossible, but to structure the system in a way that remains functional across a range of possible outcomes. And this is where resilience begins to replace fragility as the defining characteristic. From a mathematical standpoint, this introduces the idea of range rather than precision, where instead of optimizing for a single expected outcome, the system is designed to perform adequately across multiple scenarios, and this reduces the impact of any single negative event while preserving the ability to benefit from positive ones, creating a more balanced and adaptable structure. This is also where the concept of optionality becomes fully realized, because with sufficient margin and stability, decisions are no longer forced, they become selectable, and having the ability to choose between multiple viable paths is one of the clearest indicators that the cycle has been broken at a structural level. Optionality, however, is not just about having choices. It is about maintaining the conditions that allow those choices to exist over time, which means protecting the system from reverting back into compression, and this often requires ongoing attention to the same fundamentals that created stability in the first place, even when they no longer feel urgent. There is a tendency at this stage to gradually relax those constraints, to increase consumption, to reduce buffers, or to take on new obligations that appear manageable in isolation, but collectively begin to reintroduce pressure into the system. And this is how cycles can quietly restart, not through a single major event, but through a series of small shifts that accumulate over time. Understanding this pattern is critical because it highlights that the boundary between stability and instability is not fixed, it is dynamic, and maintaining position requires continuous alignment between income, obligations, and behavior, rather than a one-time correction that permanently solves the problem. This is why long-term financial systems are best understood as feedback loops, where each decision influences the next set of available decisions. And over time, these loops either expand or contract the system's capacity, depending on the direction of those choices, which means that progress is less about isolated actions and more about sustained patterns. At a higher level, this reflects a broader principle seen in many complex systems, where stability emerges not from the absence of stress, but from the ability to absorb and adapt to it. And financial systems are no different, because they operate within environments that are constantly changing, requiring ongoing adjustment rather than static solutions. And when viewed through this lens, the original question begins to resolve itself more clearly. Because the reason most people never escape debt cycles is not simply that they fall into them, but that they are continuously interacting with systems that reward short-term stability at the expense of long-term flexibility, making it difficult to create the conditions necessary for sustained change. But for those who do manage to shift the structure, even gradually, the trajectory begins to separate, not immediately in visible outcomes, but in the underlying mechanics, where each decision contributes to expanding capacity rather than constraining it, and over time, this divergence becomes more pronounced as the effects compound. Eventually, the system reaches a point where progress no longer depends on constant correction, because the structure itself supports forward movement, and while effort is still required, it is no longer spent resisting collapse, but instead directed toward refinement and intentional growth. And in that state, the original cycle loses its influence, not because it has been erased, but because the conditions that sustained it no longer exist, and without those conditions, the patterns cannot reform in the same way, allowing the system to operate on an entirely different trajectory. So in the end, escaping a debt cycle is less about a single breakthrough and more about a gradual reconfiguration of how money, time, and decisions interact. And once that configuration changes, the outcomes follow, not as sudden transformations, but as steady shifts that accumulate over time, eventually leading to a system that is not only stable, but capable of adapting, expanding, and sustaining itself well beyond the constraints it once faced.